everybody, and welcome to another beautiful Thursday morning. You're listening to Bhavani at iEat Green on the Progressive Radio Network. And I have a great show planned for you all today. My guest is going to be a dear friend of mine, Rameshwar. He is the co-author of Ram Dass's new memoir called Being Ram Dass. And I'm so excited to have him on and to talk about this book and Ram Dass's life. I know it's a little bit different than most of my guests where we're focusing on food and the environment, but feeding people was really, a main focus of Neem Karoli Baba, Ram Dass's guru. And that's where I really connect. So I'm really excited to have Rameshwar on, and I'll tell you more about him in just a little bit. First, I want to share with you some things going on in and around the news, some ways that you can take action, and of course, share my weekly recipe with you. First, I want to let everyone know, if you don't know already, that next Saturday, March 13th, is NOFA New York and Slow Food North Shore's CSA Fair. CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. And this is an event that we started doing many years ago. Last year, of course, we had to skip because of COVID. This year, we went ahead and planned it as an outdoor event. So we're setting it up as a farmer's market, and it will be Saturday, March 13th, outdoors at the Sisters of St. Joseph, which is in Brentwood, which is kind of in the middle of the island, so that the farmers from out east can come and that all the people from Queens, Nassau, and out east can come and meet everybody. And the beauty about having a CSA fair where all the farmers who have the community supported agricultural programs can come in one area so that you really can compare and walk from tent to tent. Everyone's going to have pop-up tents. Like I said, we're setting up like a farmer's market. You can go from one farm to the next and talk to them about their CSA fair. You can find out how much does a share cost. Do they offer half shares if you're only a couple and you don't want a whole big box of produce every week? Or can you get it every other week? Also, do you have to pick it up at the farm, or do they have drop-off points that are closer to your house? Do they offer add-ons? Some CSAs only sell what they grow. Some CSAs have arrangements with other farmers who grow flowers or produce cheese or eggs or bread or raise sustainable meat. So there's many different options for add-ons as well. Do they have a sliding scale or a payment plan, or do you have to pay up front? Most CSAs ask for the money up front because the farmers need the money up front to buy their seeds, to buy any amendments for their soil, to do soil testing and all that kind of stuff. So the money up front really helps them, but they are aware that some people can't do that. So some CSAs offer payment plans or sliding scale. But one of the other beauties about joining a CSA is you're really joining a community. You're coming together with other people that care about the food they eat, that want to maybe visit the farm, do some farm activities, help harvest a day, have some potluck meals. Hopefully we will be returning to that time where we are able to share a meal together. So this CSA fair is really going to be just so nice. Everyone's coming out of quarantining all winter long, all year long, I should say. And I know everyone's anxious just to see their community. So we hope you will come. We do have Sunday set up as a rain date. Sunday, March 14th is the rain date. Oh, and we also arranged for the Green Street food truck to be there, so that there will be some delicious gluten-free vegan food to warm your bellies. We also will have Mike and Son's knife sharpening truck there. So if you've been doing a lot of cooking as I have, bring your knives and have them sharpened there. And we will have live music. So we are really trying to make it an event because we are all event deprived after a year of being at home. So we hope to see you there. And now some things going on in the news. There was a great article in the New York Times last week about highly processed foods and whether or not they're addictive. And, I was surprised, actually not so surprised, to find out that more than half of the calories that the average American eats is from ultra-processed foods. Chips and crackers and, sodas and all this kind of ultra processed foods that have no nutritional value. And these foods are made by food scientists in a lab. They're not even chefs. They're not made in a kitchen. They are actually designing these foods and testing them to find out that perfect point at where they can get you addicted, but not spend too much money, right? They want to cut back on the expensive stuff, add in the cheap stuff. And it's really very sad. And another thing I wrote about when it comes to take action is to actually, I have a link on my website to protect kids from junk food ads. Right now, all these kids are doing their schooling online, and food companies are advertising to them. So while our kids are struggling to try to do their lessons online, they are being bombarded by food ads to eat junk food. It's just such a wrong, bad situation. And so please, on my website under Take Action, there is a link from the Center for Science in the Public Interest asking us all to sign this petition to remove junk food from online school advertising. Another thing I wrote about this week is regenerative grazing, which is really starting to get some more attention. Our industrial agricultural system, as we all know, is desecrating our soil and is creating a whole systemic system that is promoting these highly unhealthy foods, while at the same time, using lots of chemicals and pesticides and herbicides in the soil, GMO seeds. It's just all bad. And regenerative grazing is a way of bringing back the topsoil into the land. And most of the farms, I think the statistic is 1/3 of our topsoil is gone. And the only way to rebuild topsoil is really through regenerative grazing. Have the animals, instead of in the feedlots where we know it's just adding to greenhouse gas emissions and pollution, instead put them out on the field, let them trample the weeds, let them poop all over, and let that rebuild the soil. So there's, a lot of evidence as to why that's a good thing. So whether you're a vegetarian, vegan, meat eater, whatever, we know that we can do a better job. So please check that out. And now I'd like to share with you all this week's recipe. And I just had a craving for like a pizza, but not a regular pizza. This is a spinach, tofu, and mushroom masala pizza. It's kind of like palak paneer on top of pizza. But Trader Joe's makes these really great wood-fired pizza crusts that are frozen in the freezer. And there's just water, flour, and yeast in the ingredients. It's really very clean. And they're delicious. And so it's a great midweek meal. And I use frozen spinach for this. But the trick I want to share with you is what I've been doing with my tofu lately is I cube my tofu. Well, I first slice it and I lay it out on a dish towel so that I dry it a bit, cut it into cubes. But instead of just cooking it right into a wok where when you stir fry it, very often it falls apart, I have been using my oven a lot more and baking the tofu. So what I do is I make a breading with nutritional yeast. And in this case, since it had an Indian profile, I used a 1/4 cup of nutritional yeast, a teaspoon of cumin, a 1/2 teaspoon of turmeric, a 1/2 teaspoon of ginger powder, a 1/2 teaspoon of curry powder, and a 1/2 teaspoon of garlic powder, plus a little bit of salt. And I made a kind of a mixture with the nutritional yeast. I put the cubes of tofu into the bowl with the nutritional yeast breading, and then using a spatula instead of your hands, where again, if you could easily break the tofu up, I actually take a spatula and take the spatula underneath the pile of tofu and carefully lift it up and over, and keep doing that until all the tofu cubes get covered with this nutritional yeast. And then I lay it out flat on a baking sheet and bake it in the oven. And I put parchment paper down on the baking sheet. I spray it with just a little bit of olive oil or coconut oil, whatever you like, and bake it at a 375 or 400-degree oven. Actually, in this recipe, I wrote a 500-degree oven. That was for the pizza, but you can start with a lower temperature, 400 degrees for the tofu, and bake it just for about 10, 15 minutes until it starts getting a crust all over it. It gets golden brown crust, and it's crispy on the outside, still beautifully soft on the inside, and it's just great. And then I will add it to the mixture after. So that's the first step of this recipe. And I use that in so many of my recipes now. I make the tofu that way and then add it to my stir fry if that's what I'm doing. But in this case, I did that with the tofu. And then in a separate saucepan, I made the other mixture, which is the onions, spinach, and mushrooms. And so let's see where I was just talking. So in a separate saucepan, I sauteed the mushrooms with the ginger and garlic. And after 5 minutes, I added 2 tablespoons of aji marin and 1 tablespoon of tamari. Aji marin is a sweet rice wine, which is a wonderful Asian cooking ingredient. And be careful when you buy it, though. Make sure that you buy like a brand like Eden makes a very good quality aji marin. Kikkoman, if you go to Whole Foods, they sell Kikkoman aji marin, and if you look at it, it's glucose syrup. It has nothing to do with aji marin. It's not, has no sweet rice wine in it. So be careful with that. And then tamari is just like a soy sauce, except it's wheat-free. So that's why I always use tamari. So if I have any gluten-free people, I'm safe with them. And so you cook those mushrooms in that saucepan on just until all that liquid is absorbed and the mushrooms actually become a little crispy and golden brown. And then just leave those onto the side. Then in a wok, you can saute your onions, add your spinach to that. You're going to add a tablespoon of minced ginger, a tablespoon of minced garlic. I used a bag of frozen spinach because this time of year, why not? It's chopped, it's easy, it's quick. I run it under hot water just to defrost it, and then I squeeze all the water out before I add it to the wok. So you start by sauteing your onions, and I used 1 onion for that I chopped up, sauteed that. Then I added the spinach. With the spinach, in addition to the garlic and the ginger, I added a half a teaspoon of cumin and a half a teaspoon of curry powder, another teaspoon of garlic, and the garlic and the ginger were with the mushrooms, sorry. And then I just sauteed all that together in the wok. Then I added the mushrooms into that and the tofu into that. And then I spread that over the 2 pizza crusts that I got from Trader Joe's and put those into a 500-degree oven just for about 10 minutes until the pizza crust gets really crispy. And it was just so quick and easy and delicious. If you want, you can sprinkle some vegan mozzarella cheese on top, or if you are a cheese eater, you can use regular mozzarella cheese. Or you can just leave the cheese off if you want, whichever way. But it was delicious. I garnished it with some fresh cilantro, and it was yummy. So I hope you guys make it. And of course, I love feedback. So if you make it, if you have anything you added to it to make it even better, let me know. And just let me know. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Rameshwar. Rameshwar is, as I said, a dear friend, and he was on my show back in 2013 after Polishing the Mirror was published. And I asked him to come on again to talk about this latest book, being Ram Dass. And Rameshwar has been navigating a spiritual path for 50 years. He met Ram Dass back in 1968 and spent time with Neem Karoli Baba in India from 1970 to 72. And Neem Karoli Baba is Ram Dass's guru, who we will be talking about. Rameshwar learned Vipassana meditation from Goenka in India. And he's worked as an artist, photographer, environmentalist, and writer ever since. He's collaborated on many projects with Ram Dass over the years, including the original Be Here Now book and the Love, Serve, Remember recordings. And he's co-author with Ram Dass on 3 books, Be Love Now, Polishing the Mirror, and Being Ram Dass. And I just finished reading the book, and I just was so surprised by how much of Ram Dass's life I actually didn't know. even though I have known Ram Dass for a long time myself. And so I've heard many of these stories, but I never get tired of them. And I'm really excited to have Rameshwar on and talk about these, talk about this book and talk about all the stories. So, Ram, let's talk. How are you, Rameshwar?
I'm good. I'm got hungry hearing that pizza recipe, though.
Oh, well, make it. It's coming together so quick. It's so easy and it's yum.
As you know, I've been sequestered with another gourmet cook, so
I
it's
do
been
know. Kate, Kate is another wonderful chef, Ramesh Das's wife, and so we have a lot that we share.
yeah.
Um, so Ram Dass started out as a psychologist. Can you share with everyone what was the trajectory of his life and why is he such a pivotal figure?
Well, he was an unusual. It was almost like he'd been set up to play this role of kind of intermediary and bridge to Eastern spirituality. Starting with his psychology training, he was learned child development and motivational psychology were the two primary fields that he worked in psychology. And this is in the 50s, and he began practicing clinical psychology, doing therapy, before people were getting licensed to do therapy. So he just, walked into the university therapy office and said, "I'd like to do this."
Uh-huh.
And so he started doing it. And the condition was that he had to get psychoanalyzed himself.
Right, right. They called it social psychology, right? Like as opposed to clinical psychology. It was like
Well, it was clinical psychology. It was the beginning of clinical
uh-huh.
psychology, but it was, early on.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Stories of
he
him
was
on
kind of
the
a pioneer on that score also.
uh-huh.
And then he did his PhD at Stanford and became a professor there, which was very unusual because they had a policy against hiring grad students, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But they hired him because he was such a good teacher.
Right.
And the students really loved him, and they needed somebody to teach the introductory psychology course.
Uh-huh.
So he was a professor at Stanford for a couple of years, and then his old mentor, who had supervised his master's degree, had moved to Harvard, and he invited then Richard Alpert to come to Harvard, where he taught both in the education department and this new institute for personality research that was headed by his old mentor, who was named David McClelland. And he was quite a wonderful guy. But anyway, he invited a new professor to join the department, and his name was Timothy Leary. And that became the genesis of what was first called the Harvard Psilocybin Project.
Uh-huh.
And it turned into the Harvard Psychedelic Project, and it got them both fired eventually.
Right. It was amazing the work that they did. I mean, reading about their exploration with LSD and psilocybin from the very beginning and how it was welcomed, how it was actually a legitimate program at Harvard. It's hysterical. And then and not hysterical. I mean, it actually was doing a lot of good for a
Well,
lot
it
of
was
people.
occasionally hysterical too, but
Right.
they were serious scientific researchers.
Yeah.
And a lot of that research is now being resurrected after, the war on drugs is finally subsiding a bit.
Right. And Michael Pollan
Yeah.
writing about it,
Uh-huh.
his book about, psilocybin mushrooms and exploring and yeah, and then it's coming back, like you said, so many people who, walk around with their life with fear of death,
Yeah, it's been
really
particularly useful for
for that,
people
right?
in end stage cancer and things like that.
Right. Not being so
In
afraid.
fact, there's a project in New York at NYU, which has been one of the centers of that research.
Ah, uh-huh. Yeah, it's fascinating. So, how did you first meet Ram Dass?
Well, I was in college in Connecticut at Wesleyan University, where I later found out, I may not have known it until I did this book with him, that he had done his master's degree there
Uh-huh.
in
Right, a few
psychology
years
with
before
David
you.
McClellan.
Uh-huh.
And by the time I got there, some of his students were teaching psychology at Wesleyan.
Uh-huh.
And they invited Richard Alpert to come lecture after he'd been kicked out of Harvard. And he got the message from them at the ashram in the Himalayas, where he was learning yoga and meditation. So the first talk that he gave when he came back from India from his first trip there, and this was in, I think, March 1968. I'm expecting, Professor Alpert, and this guy shows up. This is, in frozen mud in Connecticut in March, and he's barefoot, wearing kind of a white dress and a long beard.
Uh-huh.
And he sits down and starts talking about his further explorations in consciousness in India. And he spoke, it was in kind of a college lounge, and people were sprawled around, and it was very informal. And he started at 7:30 in the evening, and he talked until 3 in the morning.
Right, right. I read about that. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
And it changed my head. I mean, it changed my point of view from where I saw myself. It was, and when I got to India, I went to see his guru 2.5 years later, and it was the same feeling I had from that first night that I met Ram Dass.
Uh-huh.
So it was clear that he was kind of a channel for that experience from India.
Yeah.
Whatever that was. I mean, we got it through this old man in a blanket, but it is clearly an internal spiritual experience for whoever gets it, wherever.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember the first time I heard Ram Dass speak at Nassau Community College.
Yeah.
He was on Long Island. I think it was 73 or 74.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I first met him. But I was already going to Hilda's, right?
Yeah.
Hilda Charlton in the city, and as a high schooler, this was, a big
expansion of your universe, no doubt.
I'd go every week. It was every Thursday night, I think, or every Tuesday night. One day during the week, every week, I'd go to St. John the Divine, and there'd be hundreds of beautiful hippie-looking people that I wanted to know. Those are the people that I was attracted to, and it was just, and that's,
I think Hilda maintained half of Manhattan for many years.
Yeah, she was amazing. She was amazing. So, what were some of the central issues that Ram Dass was concerned about through his life? I mean, I know he had his identity roles, of course, sexuality was not as open then as it is now. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think the central focus and where he started and even the beginning of his psychology training was around identity and his own identity. He was had kind of a privileged, miserable upbringing. He really felt very insecure and isolated in many ways, and he was confused about his sexuality. He was alienated from, some of what was around him. He went to prep school and was kind of the overweight Jewish kid who was out of sorts with and didn't have too many friends. But he overcame a lot of that, and he began to really turn inward. And when he found psychology and he found social psychology, as you described it, not the sort of research behavioral psychology that was, testing rats in mazes and stuff like that, but looking at the human interaction and motivation and development. And he just took like that. It took to it like a fish to water. His father had wanted him to be a medical doctor, and there's a funny story in the book about him getting called into the university president's office, and the guy saying, "Okay, we've got a place for you in the medical school. I'm going to call up the dean right now." And he picks up the phone, and he says, "I got George Alpert's son here. Do you have a place for him in the medical school? Good, thank you. You're in." And Ram Dass stands up and said, "I wouldn't go to that school if you paid me."
Right.
And he walks out and becomes a psychologist.
Right. Yeah. Very different than how people getting into medical school these days, although there's still probably those connections, right?
Maybe. It's tougher.
Power.
But in any case, the identity theme really, it was resurrected in and amplified by the psychedelic experience. His first psilocybin trip at Harvard with Tim Leary completely blew him out of the water. Suddenly, he all these kind of achievement roles and becoming a Harvard professor and having a Mercedes and an airplane and a motorcycle and antiques in his apartment all became irrelevant. And he was home in the heart. And that, I think, was what guided him for the rest of his life. And when he met Maharaji in India, which maybe, this is skipping around rather a lot, but that was the next major inflection point in his life, I think, was meeting the guru. And that encounter, there's a word in Hindi or Sanskrit which is darshan, which literally translates as view, but it is that change in point of view of seeing your identity more as what Ram Dass in later years called the soul identity, rather than the ego part. And he was not, down on having an ego. It was just to understand that you are not necessarily that role.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And he helped a lot of people get there.
Yeah. And I think, psychedelics, I would say for myself, psychedelics is what opened me up to the desire to have a higher consciousness. It didn't cross my mind actually that there was anything but the mundane world that we lived in. And, I was, people were the head of the universe and everybody else was, all other creatures were below us, and the plants and everything were, we were the star people on the planet. And then, I think after you do psychedelics, you realize you're just a part of this whole greater whole.
Yeah.
And you want to know how to function your life around with that knowledge in all aspects of your life, in all your decisions and everything you do, that you are a part of a greater whole. You are not the whole universe.
I think you could say that that's exactly what Ram Dass did over the course of his life. Was he worked to integrate that insight of interconnection and wholeness into the rest of his life, and the practices that helped him to do that after psychedelics. I mean, psychedelics, I think, opened that door for a lot of us.
Right.
Did for me too.
Right.
And it was interesting because so many people who were around Maharaji had that entry, and people asked about psychedelics, and he, as you know, took a massive dose of LSD twice that Ram Dass gave him.
Right.
And nothing happened.
Really,
nothing happened. And that's hard to imagine. I mean, this was enough LSD for 5 people. to have a pretty over the moon expedition, and nothing happened.
Right.
So what he said about it was that it could take you into the room with Christ, into that opening to divinity, to wholeness, to oneness, but you couldn't stay because it was a drug and it wore off.
Right.
So, I think what Ram Dass and everyone who has had that experience and realized that it was a temporary fix has been doing ever since is trying to find the practices that will help you to integrate all that into your life.
I think one of the things that, at least for me, that was so beautiful about Neem Karoli Baba's teachings is that it was so simple. It was love everybody, serve everybody, feed everybody, and remember God. And, there wasn't like you have to do 3 hours of meditation a day and you have to do this and that much of yoga. And, there were no prerequisites. There were no rules.
There wasn't even anything to join.
Right.
You couldn't sign up.
Right.
And it was interesting, for what you do. It was amazing how much of it was around food.
Yeah.
Because food became this medium of transmitting both love and but also of a way of in India it's called prasad or blessed food. It's a way of conveying blessings. And if you one of the things that I learned to do from Ram Dass is to offer your food before you eat, and then it becomes blessed food, and you're taking in the blessings of the universe from whatever you're eating.
Yeah. I've said that a lot. I mean, when someone's cooking food for someone they love, they're actually imparting that energy into the food, and when someone then eats it, they're receiving that love, and it has a much higher nutritional value than what you can just quantify. It feeds you on a much deeper level, and I think it has healing qualities. Like I even talk about that when I cook medicinally for people who have cancer or different allergies or whatever. Sometimes if they have a craving for a comfort food, whether it's just like a bowl of pastina, which is white pasta, like you put butter and salt on it, has no nutritional value at all, but it's like baby food, but it's like comfort food, and on an occasion that could be feeding a whole nother part of you that's valuable. And so I don't throw those out. It's like I think there's room even in a healthy diet sometimes for something that's not as healthy if you're craving it, because it's going to feed your soul in another way.
Yeah, and the converse of that is, don't cook when you're angry.
Oh, yeah. And that's why eating at a restaurant, I'm telling you, how many diners I worked at when I was in high school, waitressing? Those chefs, I wouldn't want to eat that food if you paid me. If you return your eggs because they're not cooked enough, they'll spit on them, literally. I've seen chefs do that, and and if I didn't bring it back out, they'd throw it on. It was bad sometimes.
Yeah.
Chefs are known to have a temper, and so, it's really amazing. So I think this year of people being at home cooking for themselves has been very healing for many people.
Yeah. On that level. And I think what you were talking about earlier about the community farm movement, which we've been members of one out on the East End for 30 years. And
the first one, Quail Hill Farm, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. And, there have been wonderful people running that, and it's held by a land trust and all that. That community has really... first, it's helped the people around this area get their heads around eating organic, and I remember bringing our kids to that farm, and they loved being there. They could dig their own potatoes. It was like it was a serious introduction to what growing food and where it comes from is really about.
Right.
And they love that.
That's another one. That's a CSA where you pick up the food there, and you actually get to go out into the field and harvest your own potatoes. So up on the bulletin board or the board, it will say, a pound of potatoes. You get to go out and pick that pound of potatoes, dig it up. So that's really, a whole nother experience. So, that's what part of, having the fair, of the CSA fair, so people can choose what their experience is. Do you want to have to pick your potatoes, or would you rather just have them picked for you? So,
and there's always surplus from the farm also, and they are pretty good about distributing it to wherever it's needed, and like Long Island Cares and outfits like that come and do harvesting at the farms. I think it's really, because one of Maharaji's teachings was feed everyone.
Right.
He was like, you can't think about God if you have an empty stomach.
Right. If your stomach's growling, not thinking about God.
So he would say, feed people first, and then they can. And the first thing that happened when I got to the temple in India was he sat us down and fed us. They took us across the courtyard and sit down, and they give you a leaf plate, and they heap spicy potatoes, and they give you these puris, which are deep-fried flatbread fried in butter. And I was practically out of my body, and I think I ate 17 puris and 3 mountains of spicy potatoes.
Right.
Until I got a little grounded.
Lots of carbs. Yeah. Yes. I actually, had privilege of visiting that Kenchi ashram.
Yeah.
Not until after my kids were already older, and it was something I thought I'd do after college, and but life took a different course, so I became a mom pretty early on, so I had to wait to do my trip to India, but it didn't keep me from the satsang. The community that revolved around Ram Dass and Neem Karoli Baba became my extended family, and
it is extended family,
and it's just it affected my life from when I was in high school, so that's most of my life. So can you share with us some of Ram Dass's major shifts in his life? You mentioned how they made him a teacher, but then at what point did they say, enough, you're fired? And and what?
Oh, at Harvard? Yeah, that's interesting, because the book starts with him being fired from Harvard. And, early on, that was sort of the pinnacle of his aspiration, was to be a Harvard professor. And his family was from Boston, so that was high status. And he had, his father was head of a railroad, and it was, tough to live up to that one. And both of his brothers had gone to law school, and his father wanted him to be a doctor. So instead, he becomes a Harvard professor. And that still had some status, even though he wasn't making much money compared to what his father thought he should be doing.
Right.
So getting fired from Harvard was like, dying, as far as the family was concerned.
Right.
But Ram Dass, walking out of the, president of Harvard's office after being told that he was terminated, he thought, well, what just happened? I'm not feeling like, my life's over. I'm feeling liberated. And he and Leary, after that, went on to, for another few years, really pursued the psychedelic research. And, gradually that became a whole cultural phenomenon as well. And,
so he also had, one aspect of Neem Karoli Baba, as we mentioned, is service. And Ram Dass really put a lot of his energy into service. And, and that was, very altruistic and, beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about the Prison Project and the Seva Foundation and these different projects that he took on in his life that affected so many people?
Well, the Das name, Das means servant. So Ram Das is the servant of Ram, which is an incarnation of God in the Hindu
What's Rameshwar a servant of?
Rameshwar means literally it's a name for Shiva,
Ah,
and Ram is Vishnu. So Rameshwar is the Lord of Ram, and I'm the servant of that. And it was an aspect of Shiva that is worshipped by Ram in the Ramayana, which is the whole saga of Ram and Hanuman's exploits, and Sita.
right.
And it's a great story. I mean, it's really, it's so many levels of symbology and, also just literal adventure. But, and Hanuman is this monkey god who is the great servant of Ram.
Ram.
So Ram Das is also Hanuman, who's the monkey god.
Right.
Anyway, so what Ram Das, I think, really did was to bring this model of service that comes from that devotional tradition in India, and also what's in the Bhagavad Gita. And he taught this major course in 1974 at the first summer of Naropa on the Bhagavad Gita. And there's a book that has those lectures in it, or that came from those lectures, called Paths to God, that was those Bhagavad Gita lectures. But the aspect of service in the Gita is what's called seva, or selfless service. So it's basically, it's serving in whatever way comes to you, whatever way you're suited for, or what comes to you in life, but not being attached to how it comes out. It's turning it over to a higher power, or letting it be in its own way, and not being hooked into how it comes out, what changing the world from your own ego standpoint, but just trying to help others in a really deep way, and seeing that as your service to the divine also. So he started with that prison ashram project, which at the time there were thousands of people being imprisoned for very minor drug offenses, and sitting in jails for years. And that was an effort to introduce spiritual practices into prisons so people could use their time to work on themselves. And he eventually got together with a couple of devotees in North Carolina, the Lozoffs, and they took over the project, and it's still going. It's now called the Human Kindness Foundation.
Ah, I love it.
And Sita Lozoff is she's probably the chairperson emeritus at this point, but it's a great thing, and it's helped, hundreds of thousands of prisoners. There's a book of practices that they send out for free, and then the Seva Foundation, which Ram Dass helped to start with Larry Brilliant and people like Wavy Gravy from the Hog Farm Commune, and a number of doctors from the World Health Organization who had been involved in smallpox eradication originally, which is the only major disease that really has been totally wiped off the face of the earth. And it killed millions and millions of people over the years. It was around since medieval times, and the estimates of how many people that it killed or impaired is just staggering. And they went around vaccinating people. And India and Bangladesh were the last place there was smallpox. And Maharaji instructed a hippie doctor named Larry Brilliant to go help. He told him to go to WHO and go help eradicate smallpox.
And he did.
He did. But, when he went to WHO, it's a great story. He wrote a book called Sometimes Brilliant. That's really about that story. It's a wonderful story.
Yeah. But now the Seva Foundation was mostly around blindness, right?
Yes.
Same with
After smallpox, they wanted to do something else where they could really make a difference, and they decided they would take up the cause of remediable blindness, a lot of which was due to cataract and people just not getting care.
right, right. Service is just an amazing thing because I think so many people struggle with depression and they're so focused in on themselves and their problems. And I think something I have recommended, and I know many people have, Ram Dass included, one of the best things to get someone out of themselves and their own depression is to serve others.
Yeah.
It gets you out of yourself. And when you are serving others, you are giving to others, but in another way, it's also feeding you. And, service is a beautiful thing. So something that I really promote and try to
Yeah, and you do a lot of, which is really beautiful, Bhavani.
try to get people to do that a lot.
Especially that it's around food.
Yes. And this year's been hard. I'll tell you.
Yeah.
It's like I started off, doing some cooking for a food pantry and whatever, and then it kind of fizzled out. And I actually had I've been working with my husband trying to keep our other business afloat. So
it's been an interesting year. I got sequestered with the book project.
Uh-huh.
And, I've been leading a little meditation circle that I was doing at the local yoga studio. And now it's on Zoom.
Yeah, right. I was doing Zoom cooking classes at first when this first started. I figured everyone's home and indoors. Let's do some cooking classes. One thing that struck me with the book that I just wanted to ask you about, Ram Dass always refers to his mother as not as my mom, but mother.
Yeah.
Can you share with us what that relationship was? It's so formal. He doesn't refer to as my mother. It's I have to ask mother.
Yeah.
So what was that? Why was it so formal for him?
Well, she was such a central figure, and there was a lot of the dynamics of that relationship were, fraught with control issues and so many aspects of Jewish mother. But originally, going back to his birth, she had two sons and she wanted a girl. And Ram Dass turned up, or Richard. And Richard was kind of, almost feminized by her for part of his childhood. And because he was the youngest by far, I think his second brother was 5 years older and his oldest brother was 9 years older. So he was really the baby of the family. And he became sort of like a family mascot for a while.
Right. Uh-huh.
But because his brothers were off at school, a lot of his mother's control issues focused on him.
Right.
And they had a pretty fraught relationship over years. And then they really came into kind of a soul-to-soul relationship around the time that she was dying of, I think, what was finally diagnosed as leukemia. And they had this contact shortly before her death, and for the first time, they really made contact on a spiritual level in their spiritual heart. And when he got to Maharaji, it was interesting that it was Maharaji telling him about her death and his thoughts about her death. He had been out under the stars the night before thinking of her, and she had come to him kind of for the first time as a soul after her death. And he hadn't said anything to anybody. And the next day he's in front of Maharaji, not willingly. He'd been kind of towed along by Bhagwan Das. And Maharaji said, you were out under the stars last night. And he goes, yeah, you were thinking about your mother. and he's like, his mind starts racing, trying to think about how this guy in the blanket in the Himalayas could possibly know anything about his mother, to about whom he hadn't spoken to anyone.
Right. Right.
And he got kind of paranoid. But
well, that's when he first realized that
and
Maharaji
then,
knew all of his thoughts.
Yeah, that was it.
Right.
And then Maharaji tells him how his mother died, and he said, everything was in translation except Maharaji said she died of spleen, and he said spleen in English, right. And it broke Ram Dass open.
Right, right. Yeah, that was a great story.
And then later Maharaji said about his mother, she was a great soul. The word in Sanskrit is Mahatma, like Mahatma Gandhi, the great soul. Yeah. And that took Ram Dass more years to relate to her on that level. Right. So his mother was a great part of his journey.
Yeah, yeah, it sounded like that. And just the way he referred to her in such a formalized way really struck me.
Yeah, she's a very powerful figure in his life.
Yeah. So Ram Dass almost died from his stroke. That was an incredible part of the book when he was talking about how he was writing the book, I don't know if he had already named the book, but it's called Still Here Now. At the time he was trying to figure out how to finish this book. And so he's lying in bed thinking about how he could finish this book about, dying and growing older, and he
goes to sleep and he wakes up with a stroke.
Yeah,
that paralyzes his body and destroys his speech.
Yeah. And I don't know if you know, but my mom had a stroke a few years after Ram Dass.
I didn't.
My mom, that's how she ended up dying. Actually, she fell out of her wheelchair, but she had a stroke and couldn't walk or talk for over a year. And I had talked to Ram Dass about, his hyperbaric treatments and the things that he was doing to get some of his speech back. And I was working with my mom with that. But I just found it fascinating that he used that experience and was able to finish the book. And I used that book when my mom had a stroke. I joined a stroke club, of course. It's like, North Shore Hospital had a stroke club for caregivers of people who. And
it's tough stuff.
So the stroke victim would come, and also the caregivers would come, and there was things that the stroke club did together, and then things that we did separate. But I remember reading many parts of Ram Dass's book to the people in the stroke club of ways to think about their stroke. And it was so helpful. And so, maybe you could share how stroke transformed some of his teachings in his later life.
Well, I mean, for starters, it basically stopped him in his tracks.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a guy who had been on the road and was an incredible storyteller and speaker, and now he is paralyzed, can't walk, and can't talk. And it was like, first off, he lost his faith in Maharaji, who he had, thought of as the source of grace and protection, and that he was just, under that blessing. And he was like talking to Maharaji in his mind, saying, where were you when I had the stroke? Were you out to lunch? Right. And he really went through a deep crisis and very depressed for some time. And then he began to see the ways that the stroke could be positive in his spiritual life. And one of them was that, when he couldn't talk, his mind got very quiet. And that, he said, he realized that was one of the goals of meditation, to have a quiet mind. And maybe that wasn't so bad.
Right.
And, losing all of the ability to drive a car and play golf and travel around, it brought him to a stop inside also. And he went from being Mr. How can I help, the servant, to needing help from other people. And that was tremendously humbling for him. But I think the greatest effect, over time, was that it brought him out of his mind into his heart, from this kind of conceptual approach to consciousness into a space of just deep love. And that, I think, was so evident to people who were, went to see him years after the stroke. And I think that, he used to talk about dissolving into the ocean of love, and that's what it feels like happened when he left his body.
Yeah. So it took you 10 years to write this book. Can you talk about that process a little bit? We don't have that much time left, but just quickly.
Well, it was very collaborative.
Such a great book.
Yeah, it's fun. And I'm very happy with all the photos we got in there. Ram Dass' niece had all these family photos, and I went back and scanned hundreds of India photos and things like that. And lots of people contributed to this. And I want to say this, making a book like this definitely takes a village. And the Sounds True people, the publishers, have been great. And the editor that helped with it was 2 editors who really did a lot. But working with Ram Dass, it was very, his speech was slow enough so that I was often typing into the laptop at the same rate that he talked. And I was able to do that with him. Then I would read stuff back to him. And he was really participating in it. This was not me, concocting his life story. He supplied a lot of detail of things that he remembered when we started talking about them. And we were really trying to look back at his life as if through Maharaji's eyes, through the eyes of that soul place. So I don't know I hope that comes through. And we had a lot of laughs in the process, so I hope that comes through a little bit too.
It did. And I have to say, I actually, I really wanted to finish it before our interview. And so I was getting down to the wire, and I was like, the only way I'm going to get through this is if I get Audible. So I actually signed up for Audible on my phone, and I would listen to it in the car, and I'd listen to it, when I was doing things, when I was cooking, and so that I could be doing something at the same time, because it's just so hard for me to stop and sit and read. So, your Audible was lovely. I have to say, your voice, was just transformed the book into.
Oh, thank you. I really wanted to make sure I could read it too.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't, obviously, and I knew what it was about, and I've had the experience of doing one of the first book that we did. They hired a reader for it, and the next thing we know, I got a list of 90 or 100 words in Hindi and Sanskrit that the guy didn't know how to pronounce, and that was a bad sign. I mean, it's not bad, but it wasn't what you would like.
This is really great. So I just want to, we're just about out of time. I want to thank you so much, Ramesh, for joining me today on the show, for writing the book.
Oh, thank you, Bhavani.
For being such a dear friend. And everybody out there, get the book, get Audible. You'll really, really enjoy it. And
Being Ram Dass.
It's really lovely, lovely. So Ramesh Das, thank you for joining me. And everyone out there, thank you for joining us. And I'll see you all again next week. Bye for now.